This is a 2002 Maserati Coupe, and it's a beautiful Italian car with a cool brand name and a big V8 that makes almost 400 horsepower. It also costs, I don't know, 15 to 20 grand on a good day. These have become total bargains, and today I'm going to review this Maserati Coupe and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Maserati Coupe is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This car has traveled less than 20,000 miles from new. It's finished in this rather striking exterior color and it's a total bargain and you can buy it on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this Maserati Coupe where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Maserati Coupe. So let's get to it. This car came out for the 2002 model year. This is a 2002 first year model. And the arrival of this Maserati Coupe marked the return of Maserati to the US market for the first time in over a decade. So this car was a big deal, but it was especially a big deal here in the States. Now, even though this car was new for '02 and new to the US market, there was an earlier version of this car sold in Europe. It was called the 3200 GT. It looked relatively similar, except it had this very cool taillight shape that's referred to as the boomerang taillights. It also had a smaller engine than the Maserati Coupe. But the 3200 GT and its awesome taillights went away, and the Maserati Coupe appeared in '02. But while the earlier 3200 GT used a 3.2-liter V8, as its name suggests, this car, the later Maserati Coupe, had a 4.2-liter V8, made about 385 horsepower and about 335 pound-feet of torque. Pretty strong numbers even today, but especially over 20 years ago. But the coolest thing about this powertrain is that it was derived from Ferrari, specifically the Ferrari F136 engine, which was used in the F430, the California, and the 458. Variants of the engine were used in those cars and right here in the Maserati Coupe. So in addition to being a cool Italian brand name, this car also had some real Ferrari-derived performance chops with its Ferrari-derived powertrain. That made it extra special. And personally, on the subject of the engine, I have always loved how it looks in this car. It just plain looks cool. With the Maserati Trident front and center, the painted top looks really nice, the sides in red, the Maserati brand script, which has always looked cool, printed right there on the sides. This engine is fantastically cool in terms of its derivation from Ferrari, but also just the way it looks and the way it sounds. Big V8, naturally aspirated. It sounds pretty nice. Even in this relatively subdued sort of GT car, take a listen to the Maserati Coupe and some revs. But anyway, now that we've covered the basics, next we move on to the quirks and features of this car, starting with maybe the biggest quirk of all, right here. This section of the car right here. Doesn't seem so quirky, but get this. This car was sold in two versions. There was a hardtop model, this one called the Maserati Coupe, and there was a soft-top convertible called the Maserati Spyder. The interesting thing was the Coupe was a four-seater, 2 front seats and 2 rear seats. The Spyder was a 2-seater convertible, and the result was the cars had different sizes, different wheelbases, different lengths, different bodies, and only the Coupe has this larger section behind the front door in front of the rear wheel. The Spyder was a smaller, shorter car that had a completely different look to it since it didn't have rear seats. They should have been just the same car, but one had a fixed roof and the other had a convertible top, but that's not what they did. They are very different vehicles and very different overall sizes and shapes. Now, between the two body styles, I've always felt that the convertible model looks a little bit better. The shorter wheelbase, I always thought kind of looks better than the longer, sort of extended length looking coupe. But the truth is, both cars are beautiful. This car has clean, flowing, simple, elegant lines that looks great. No extra gouges or cuts or stylistic details just to draw attention. It was a simple, basic, elegant, classy design, a beautiful overall look, which is no surprise because this car was designed by Giugiaro, the famous Italian designer who created some of the most iconic automotive shapes in history, like the Di Tommaso Mangusta, a beautiful car, the original Lotus Esprit, the original Maserati Ghibli, and of course, the Daewoo Leganza. I'm kidding, but that actually is true. And it is also true that Giugiaro created some true automotive icons and some weird ones. But he created this, and it is gorgeous. A truly beautiful overall design, very simple, very clean. One interesting quirk in the design of this car, though, is the fuel door, which you can see back here. It's pressed into this sort of stamped area in the rear quarter panel. This is the only stamped panel on the outside of the car that doesn't have the typical flowing curvy lines. It's stamped in there, I suspect, because Giugiaro was trying to hide the look of the fuel door. Unfortunately, he did not succeed, and it is very clearly visible, but that was probably the attempt. And you have the same thing over on the other side for symmetry, even though no fuel door over there. Now, the result of this is the fuel door in this car is a little bit quirky because of how high up it is, basically even with the window line almost to the roof and back. A little strange, but that's why I suspect they did it. Now, other things that broke up Giugiaro's beautiful design, in the back, you have a fixed antenna on the rear quarter panel, which doesn't really look that great, and you have parking sensors sort of stuck on the rear bumper. Don't really look particularly nice or well integrated either, but that was a sign of the times. In the late 90s, early 2000s, you had fixed antennas and kind of ugly parking sensors. Automakers hadn't yet figured out how to conceal them like they do now. So you have those features, that means you have that stuff on the car. Around back, you can also see the quad exhaust pipes, which of course show this car meant business. Despite its relatively flowy, curvy, not particularly aggressive design, quad pipes meant you knew you were dealing with something fast and powerful. Now, next up, we're going to climb into the Maserati Coupe, but first, we got to talk about the key, which is blue, which is unusual because it doesn't match the color of this car at all. The reason they went with a blue key is because this was Maserati's special color back at the time. They used a little bit of this blue in their logo, and they also incorporated it into their cars. The flagship supercar, the MC12, had this blue on the outside and on the inside on a lot of different surfaces, and it also made its way to the key of all the Maserati Coupes and Quattroporte models from this era. It doesn't really match, it looks kind of strange, but it's what they did. Just as unusual, the buttons on the key, you got two. One is the power trunk button, and the other one has a bunch of dots on it. This button is, of course, the lock and unlock button. It has the same function, so you press to unlock, you press to lock, and that's the situation with the rather unusual key. But anyway, next we climb inside the Maserati Coupe, and when you open the door, you initially notice two things right away. For one, the Maserati script, written beautifully, large print on the door sill, makes you feel like you're climbing into something special. There's also a little notation here that this car was specifically built for someone, for Jim Drummond, it appears. It's kind of cool to see that. This was a tailor-made, specially ordered car for one person, which is interesting. You can only imagine how excited Jim was to be getting into a Maserati after this brand had been away from the US market for so long. Probably one of the very first people saw in a long time. It is kind of cool to see that sort of tailor-made thing. And on that subject, when you get in this car and start to look around, you can clearly tell that this car came from another different, better era of Maserati before the brand moved on to lease deals and a lot of recycled Chrysler switchgear to back when Maserati was still an exotic brand. Just look at the door panel. It is all leather, as you can see. 2 different tones of leather with nice stitching, beautiful design in the stitching, and contrasted color piping for trim. It looks gorgeous. Same deal when you get inside. There is leather everywhere in here, like you would expect from an Italian exotic car, which is what the Maserati brand used to be. The dashboard is this 2-tone affair. Light and dark colors, looks very nice and very high quality with, again, contrast color piping going all the way down across the center control stack. It looks exotic. It looks Italian. And check out the headliner, which is fully leather. The entire headliner and all of the covers over the pillars and the sides of the car. Everything is leather wrapped in here, which you would want from a true high-end exotic car. Again, very different from what the Maserati brand has come to represent today. This headliner even has rows of stitching perfectly spaced that make it look especially beautiful both in front and in back. It's really fantastic to see. And it goes beyond just the materials. There's also some design choices Maserati made to emphasize that this car is special. Take a look at the clock in the center control stack, this oval shape, the Maserati print of the gold on the outside. It looks very classy and upscale. And check out the gauges. Same deal here. They look beautiful. They look nice, not just basic, regular things stuck on there. They spent some true time and effort to make something that looked finely crafted. It was a different time for Maserati. But of course, in an old school Italian car with fine craftsmanship and hand construction, you'll find some weird stuff, and this car has no shortage of that. For example, the mirror controls are mounted right here in this center console storage area. They look like they were completely forgotten about when Maserati was designing this interior, and they just stuck them into this area and took away a lot of your storage space. And that's probably because they were forgotten about, and so this is where Maserati had space to stick them when they finally remember. The trunk button to unlock and open the trunk in back, it doesn't exist anywhere in this interior under any circumstances until you open the glove box, and then there is a trunk button. But a regular button to just tap to open the trunk, no, you must first open the glove box. Not exactly convenient. And then how about the dome lights in this car? You can see there are 2 of them, big and little, and they are controlled with 2 buttons showing lights that are big and little. Do you want to turn on big dome light? Well, you press the big dome light button. You want to turn on little dome light? Well, you press little dome light button. You don't have individual lights, driver and passenger. You just choose between big and little. And then there's the matter of cruise control. This car has cruise control, but activating it is rather unusual because it's done on the turn signal stalk, which is not where any rational automaker puts their cruise control controls, but in this car, that's where you turn it on and adjust your cruise control. Certainly strange. And then how about in the middle of the interior, instead of a gear selector, an automatic transmission lever you move, or a manual lever, you have this little T, which is tremendously small and quite flimsy. You kind of push it up and down, you can move it all around. It doesn't seem that high quality. That little stick does nothing other than shift the car into reverse. You pull it up and back, and then you go into reverse. There is no traditional gear selector in this car. Instead, selecting gears is done with the paddles mounted on the steering column. On the right, the upshift, on the left, downshift. So you put it in reverse with this little T, and then you want to go back into first, you pull the right paddle to upshift from reverse back into first. Now, a couple of interesting quirks with this transmission situation. This was called Cambiocorsa. That's what they called it. And it was a sequential manual transmission, which meant you were changing gears sequentially, but the car did it automatically for you without using a clutch pedal. Ferrari had a similar system. They called it the F1 transmission. And then it was relatively common on performance cars from this era. A sequential manual transmission, in this case, case called Cambiocorsa. Now, you could also option this car with a manual transmission if you wanted, and examples with the 3-pedal manual are more desirable, in part because they're more fun, in part because they're rarer. Only about 15% of these cars were made with a manual transmission, but this one and most of them came with Cambiocorsa. And you didn't have to shift gears if you didn't want. There's a button for automatic mode. You press it here, auto, and then the car would shift gears for you, although it was a lot smoother if you shifted yourself and followed a certain procedure, as I will explain in the driving portion a little bit later. As for the buttons in this interior, I should mention, they aren't labeled. You can see here in the center console and control stack, the buttons are all black, they're all different sizes and shapes, but there's no labels. This was not done this way from the factory. Instead, it was a change that some previous owner made. The buttons start to get sticky and kind of degrade over time, and so someone had these fixed, but the labels weren't correctly put back on, and so the buttons aren't really labeled. But fortunately, the owner of this car has a handy diagram in the glove box showing where everything is in case you need help. Actually, the good news is that most of these buttons aren't even really all that important, because the vast majority of them control the infotainment system, which they call the Maserati Info Center. And as you can imagine, early 2000s car, this is not a particularly high quality infotainment situation. You have this relatively small screen. It is not a touch screen, as you can see, and it's controlled with all the buttons and dials around it. Not that you would ever want to do that. Now, unfortunately, this Info Center is the readout, the display for the climate control system. And so when you make climate adjustments, they're shown on this display screen, but heavily delayed. You can see I changed the temperature of the climate control, and it takes a second or two for the Info Center to figure out that's what I've done. Same with the fan speed. It's kind of hilarious to watch the delay, but that's how life was in the early 2000s. Generally speaking, overall, this Maserati Info Center is difficult to use by modern standards, where we're all used to large, tremendously responsive touch screens. It's not especially easy, made even harder by the unlabeled buttons, but I don't think most people will care, because I don't think most people are going to dial up a destination in the Maserati Info Center and then use this 21-year-old navigation to get there. Now, as for the gauge cluster, it is far more reasonable, and like I said, elegant, attractive, looks good, looks high quality, and it has a few quirks of its own. Unquestionably, the biggest is the way the gauge cluster displays when doors are opened. You have a top-down view of the car, and then a little red bar appears by an opened door on that side. It doesn't show the door open or the trunk open, but instead a red bar signifying that one of those items is open, which I guess you can interpret and figure out. Now, the other interesting situation in the gauge clustered steering area is starting up this car. It has to be in neutral to be started. You can't leave it in first. Now, you can park it in first gear just like a manual car, or park it in reverse, but when you start it, you got to put it in neutral. And the way to do that isn't tremendously obvious if you don't know these cars. You have to pull both paddles at once, upshift and downshift at the same time, and that engages neutral. And once you've done that, then you can start up your Maserati Coupe. But next we move on to the back seats, which, as you can see, are tremendously small. Not actually quite as small as I was expecting, given the relatively small size of this car, but they're not exactly huge. To Maserati's credit, though, they are beautiful. The same gorgeous leather in the back seats as you have up front. Full leather with beautiful lines of stitching in the seat centers, on the seat bottoms, and the seat backrests. It all looks very, very nice. And on the side of the seat, again, the two-tone light leather and dark leather, and leather going around on the headliner, all around the back window. It looks surprisingly luxurious and high quality back there. Again, very different from the Maserati we've come to expect of today. In between the seats, you have, well, an armrest. You put it down, and it's a nice thing that adds to your comfort. And also worth pointing out, you had rear climate vents, which again was a nice touch for a back seat that probably wasn't going to be used that often, but a Grand Tourer has Grand Touring comfort and convenience features. As for the trunk, the cargo area in the Maserati Coupe, you open up the trunk lid and you can see it's not really all that large back here. In fact, it's especially small, smaller than I was expecting. You don't have an enormous amount of space in this trunk, but you do have two interesting quirks back here. One, you can lift up the floor beneath the trunk and you can see extra storage down here. Now, I suspect there was supposed to be a spare tire here, but probably a small temporary spare tire you wouldn't really want to use, and it's gone anyway. So in this car, you got extra storage, which frankly is probably more useful than some crappy spare. More interesting though is the handle you can pull to climb out in case someone kidnaps you in their Maserati Coupe. You can see on the handle is a Maserati Coupe, and it's a very faithful look at this design, right up to including the little panels on the side that conceal the fuel door right behind the rear windows. They got it all. They got it all right, and it really is a Maserati Coupe on the "you've kidnapped me" latch. Anyway, next up, let's talk about what happened after this car went away. So the Coupe was sold from 02 to 07, 08, like I mentioned, and then it was replaced by the Maserati Gran Turismo, which is sort of the entry-level performance car in the Maserati lineup. That car, of course, was larger, longer, the styling more expressive, a little bit more exotic than the Maserati Coupe. At the very end of the Maserati Coupe years, they introduced a high-performance version of this car called the Gran Sport, which looked better. It had a really nice look to it, bigger wheels, kind of more aggressive styling, but the Gran Sport was only ever offered with the automatic. In total, Maserati made about 13,400 units of this car, between the Coupe, the Spyder, the Gran Sport, all of them, of which about 3,000 total were Gran Sport models. There was a Coupe and a Spyder Gran Sport as well. Now, of the total number, 13,400, about 11,400 were made with an automatic transmission, like I mentioned, the Cambiocorsa that's in this car. So like I said, about 15% of these have manuals. And overall, a 13,000 unit production run, not particularly high. This is a relatively rare car from an era when Maserati wasn't all about volume like they are today, and it's relatively special, especially for the dollar amount this car costs. All right, driving the Maserati Coupe. And I gotta tell you, the first thing you notice when you get in this car, especially compared to a modern Maserati, this car is exotic. This is an exotic car. And I say that because a new Maserati still has the Maserati brand name, but you get in and there's Chrysler switchgear and a lot of plastic, and it feels like trash. That's not true of the MC20 and nice versions of the other cars, but most Ghiblis and Quattroportes from the last, 8 or 9 years, they're just... This car, you get in, you turn the key, it has this exotic sound to it because it's a Ferrari-derived engine. You look around and you have, this isn't the interior color I would choose, but leather everywhere. This feels like a special exotic car, which is all the more reason why it's impressive that you can buy these things for so little money. I'm not surprised that the Ghibli has depreciated to the level that it has. It deserves that. But this car just feels more special. It looks cooler, you see them way less often, and it just has a special feel to it that Ghibli doesn't have, and frankly will never have if you have even the slightest level of sophistication about cars. So, let's drive this car. The biggest complaint that everybody has about these is the transmission, the automatic transmission. These were offered with a manual. The manuals are more desirable. They go for more money. They deserve to. They're cooler. They're more fun. They're more engaging. They're more exciting. All of that is true. However, automatics are obviously easier to find. They're cheaper, so there's that benefit. But the big thing to me about the automatic in this car, and I've mentioned this in a couple other videos reviewing single clutch, like F1 style sequential manual automatics, it feels mechanical in a way that is becoming desirable to me. I hated this transmission when this car was new, but in an era where electric cars have no transmission and dual clutch cars are so quick shifting, everything just feels, the mechanical feel is taken away. This has kind of a charming mechanical feel to it. Now, I will say that in order to feel charmed by it, you have to drive it right. And that means you have to let off the accelerator when you're making a gear change, just like you do in a manual transmission car. If you do that, it's actually pretty smooth and it's not even really all that slow. And you can feel it re-engage, and that's when you dive back in with the accelerator. Now, if you're looking for the fastest, the tightest, the most excitingly lightning quick, this isn't that. And I don't want to go around being like, oh, it's fine, it's slow, but it's fine. It's not fine in terms of speed and performance, but in terms of like the mechanical old school feel that this car kind of offers generally, I mean, this is a 23-year-old car, the transmission adds to it, and I don't think it's as bad. It's grown on me. So let's talk about the other stuff. Number one, the engine. Great. Just a fantastic powertrain in this car. You got a great power band. It feels strong and powerful. Because it was Ferrari-derived, they were using that as the block. I mean, they took this engine seriously, and it shows in terms of the way it accelerates, the way it sounds, and the way it feels. This car handles great. It's flat, it's planted, it goes around corners quickly. It's excellent in terms of the way that it feels when you're pushing it around corners. There's not all that much body roll. There's some, but not that much. For a car from this era at this price point, it handles well. Steering is another story. I have never liked how these cars steered. And I worked at a Ferrari dealer in 2009 and drove these when they were only, you know, the Gran Turismo was just coming out. So some of the ones I drove were only 2-3 years old. And I remember hating the steering then, even as a kid who didn't really know that much about cars. Now, hating is the wrong word, but it's just over-assisted. It is not tremendously precise or quick to steer, and you feel like it's over-assisted and over-boosted and like you're not in as much control as you would want to be. This was a general problem in the late 90s and early 2000s as automakers kind of figured out how to do power steering well in a performance car, but they didn't execute it great here. Now let's talk about braking. Braking performance in these cars was generally pretty good and pretty impressive. This car, the brakes have some shudder. I feel like the rotors might be a little warped, but I generally felt that the braking was excellent, like you would want from a performance car. There really legitimately is a decent amount to like about this car, especially at the price point. I mean, that's the thing. If this car was 60 grand, it would be a different conversation. But at the $15,000 mark, tell me what you can get that's more exotic. And I know it's gonna have some reliability troubles and all that. You gotta prepare for it to not be a true $15,000 car like a Corolla. But in terms of an exotic car at this number, it's way cooler than the Maserati bi-turbo. It's more fun to drive than a lot of stuff that costs a lot more money. Don't confuse this with the Maseratis that came later, beginning in 2015. This car comes from an era when Maserati was still a low volume manufacturer and they took themselves seriously as a company that made special cars. And this is a special car, and it's fun to drive, and it's exciting. And it just kind of feels a little bit on the exotic side, and it's especially cool for the money. And so that's the 2002 Maserati Coupe. These cars get some criticism for reliability, for being sort of the cheap Maserati, but man, for what these cost, the level of exotic and excitement and performance to the dollar value is hard to match. And you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this Maserati Coupe a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 54 out of 100, which places the Maserati Coupe here against similar cars. A point behind the Maserati Coupe I reviewed earlier with 3 pedals, but still a respectable showing. I actually like the Maserati Coupe. It's beautiful, and it comes from an era before Maserati gave up on being special in a pursuit of volume. This still feels like an exotic car, unlike recent Maserati models, and it's shockingly cheap to buy. Just set aside money for maintenance and repairs if you own one.